So we had a nice conversation in the morning, and we wanted to hear from other part of the world, from Anand, as to what is happening in Rio particularly, and how he thinks about this issue. Anand is here.
I think we're interested in assessment. So I'm Salzburg's partner manager, relationship manager at the foundation, and the reason that we are interested in the kind of assessment pieces, it's quite often the bit that feels like the block, like, oh well, we would change everything, but we've still got to pass exams, you know. And so that for us, it feels like it's the kind of quite often it's the, you know, we obviously talk about pedagogy, assessment, and curriculum because it exists on a piece of paper. Like, it sometimes feels like it's quite easy to do curriculum because people know what it looks like and they can hold it in their hands, you know. But I think often that means, but the assessment piece is still like such a huge kind of elephant in the room, that it's a really important one for us to crack, I think, if we're going to see that level of reform.
Sure, because we are used to testing, but there is a difference between testing and assessment. So that is why we sometimes get embroiled in that, because you cannot have a parallel. The way you test, say, science or mathematics, you can't be testing a range of skills, attitude on that same tool. So it has got to be. And that is why we were very closely looking at the OECD's recent report on, say, beyond academic learning, to actually get some more ideas as to how you can assess different kind of skills and attitude. Well, I think I could see Renan here. He seemed to have joined. Renan, where are you?
Hi, Shailendra. How are you? Good to see you.
Hi. So you actually tested my breadth of skills, Renan, here by getting late. I was thrown out of my bed to come and join in this session.
Sorry, my friend. I appreciate it. I was wrapping up in the event. I'm so sorry.
No problem. I thoroughly enjoyed that. So over to you.
Thank you, my friend. Hi, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here talking to you all. My name is Renan. I am from Rio, Brazil. Just here in the Education Department of Rio, which is the second largest city in Brazil. And we have almost 700,000 students here. I'm the Secretary of Education and have dedicated my life to work with education policies in Brazil and abroad. And here we are for this big challenge. And since we joined in like the Salzburg Global Seminar, we had the pleasure to talk about like different topics. And I think like what we would like to share here is just like a summary of what we discussed in the previous meetings. It's a very interesting cohort of participants because we have Shailendra from India, we have Grace from Kenya, we have Kimang from China, and myself coming from Brazil. So I think it's the most global group of participants of this year Global Seminar. And the idea is here just to share a few thoughts about our discussion of breadth of skills. And then I'd like to just pose like a few top questions and love to hear from your personal experiences and professional experience about this and how we can improve in terms of sharing these experiences abroad. There's so much going on because of the pandemic and especially due to all the transformations that have to go through education. But let me share here my screen and then we can start. In this previous, can you guys see here?
Yeah, this is visible. Yep, this is fine.
Okay, just here all right. So in this previous like weeks and months, actually, we have talked so much about like this theme, and we try just like to take like from our country's perspectives or subnationals perspectives, or like what's going on today and how the pandemic has changed like this this field right now, and how we can together try to adapt like to the post-COVID era, right? Not in a way that we have finished like the pandemic, but that the virus, the pandemic is around us, but education should be prioritized. But the first thing, and talking more about skills assessment, I think like the one first question that I would like to pose here is like how we create value from skills assessment and education, right? And I personally believe that we have three main pillars, and we try to advance these main pillars here in Rio. And I know that like my other friends like have been doing similar things around the world with that, which are first curriculum, what are kids and what are learning, what are teachers are teaching like in our schools and in our classrooms. And the second one is of course teacher training. So what they are learning when they are already in our education system, how do we keep this teacher training complementary, and how we make sure that it can be updated in a fast and efficient way, right? And an effective way, more importantly, and assessment, of course. So we need to assess to understand how we can improve our curriculum and how we can improve our teacher training. We don't assess just because it's good for itself, right? We assess because it needs consequences for that, right? And these three main pillars, they go like a circle, right? So in a circle that we need to have the learners as protagonists of this process. So if each learner, each student understand that like this main pillar, each of these pillars are important for the education process, we will probably achieve better results. And of course, the teachers and the educators in general understanding like how we need to get the assessment and move the next steps, trying to improve our curriculum, trying to make sure that our teacher training is indeed improving and not just being something formal. The second question here is about like how we engage the main actors of an education system, right? And we just tried here to pose these main actors, which are the principals of the school, the principals of our schools, the teachers that have like responsibility inside of our classrooms, and how we make these the subjects and the education experience even more how we share this experience inside the school, and also like in the education system, like between schools, which is even harder. How a school that is dealing better with some themes or with some goals can help out these other schools. And I think like that's something that we can try to do more of the principals, exchange these ideas. We have the students, of course, which should be our primary focus. And many times in education, we spend so much time thinking about important things and important topics. But I think like if we need to make a question, is like, is this really important for a student? Is this really important for our learners? Is that gonna make a change in their lives? So like having them including this process is really important. How do we put that in the table? And of course, the families, like not forgetting that the families should stay close, should be close to our schools. It's key for this transformation process, right? We believe that if we have families and schools working together, we definitely have like the education achieving better results. The third question here is about the pandemic more directly, and how the pandemic impacted the breadth of skills assessment. Should we go slower in terms of like trying to understand that the pandemic impacted so much like each student or each school, and we need to be more cautious in terms of like demanding more? Or should we go faster and saying, okay, we can't waste more time? We have wasted a decent amount of time in these past months. So we need to wrap it up, and we need to go faster in terms of like making sure that we know what students need, and we bring them more with the schools, and trying to make sure that they get the content in a faster pace. So like there is a trade-off here, right? But we also need to understand the behavioral changes, right, that have happened with the pandemic, right? There's so much impact in terms of social emotional, in a social emotional perspective, right? And so make sure that we have this support for our students, for our professionals, is key for this. And we also have different aspects of the assessment. We want to make this assessment in a more formative way. Do we want to have this assessment in the end that we are trying? Which types of assessments are we talking here? And how the pandemic made us reflect more on that. And lastly, I think like the one thing that I want to put here, and then I would love to hear from you all, your experiences, what do you see right now, and how we can exchange ideas on this, is the last question is about technology. Is it a great ally or not? And should we embrace the digital assessment for real, or is this how is that an opportunity to improve this process? I think like the technology, especially in developing countries, is still there's a lot of frustration, right? Because students and teachers, they count on an equipment that is not working so well. The connectivity, the connection is not the best one. The Wi-Fi doesn't work. So how do we really make a digital revolution, a technological revolution, and how does the pandemic really posed this scenario to us? And the second aspect of that, and that's something that I personally have, we can see a lot here in Rio, is that for the remote learning to work, the digital learning to work, we need to bring the digital to in-person education. If students don't see the teacher using the computer, the smartphone, whatever, we rarely use those equipments for their education experience, right? And we believe that the remote learning is not necessarily like a substitute to the in-person education, but can definitely help a lot, can complement a lot. And finally, we need to prepare our learners and our teachers to use technology in an effective way. It's not just, as we say here, we're not interested in just like offering. We need to make sure that this is being used, right? That we definitely have impact. So we need to provide the equipment, but we also need to form and to help out our teachers with that. So I think those are the main questions that I would like to hear to pose for the group. And I would love to hear your thoughts. Let me put here the last slide so we can all see again these questions, and love to hear if you also have any reflections beyond these questions. But that would be great that we could share our experiences and what we have seen around the world and in our personal professional experience. So feel free to jump in and we can talk more on this. Does anyone want to start? Maybe about saying that one of these questions, what's going on in your experience right now, and is this be helpful, or do you see something very differently in your country or in your state?
So I'll jump in, Renan. Thank you so much. I am from the US. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm actually here probably to learn more than anything else. I'm actually a Salzburg fellow in the social emotional group Karanga. And so this is my first time, though, in this group. I was attracted to your session, Renan, because I work in a policy shop in the US, and this is such ever since our a reauthorization of the federal law 4 years ago, and we're looking to reauthorize again soon, maybe under this administration. We've wrestled a lot with accountability, assessment for accountability. And I know what you're talking about right now is really assessment to inform learning. And I think we're still really confused in many places I go, speaking very contextualized to the US right now. The assessment for accountability seems to just really take hold of what educators are doing in their classrooms, in their schools. People really are held so accountable to how kids do on math and reading and all of the above. But yes, in the spirit of education nationally in the US, we really embrace a more holistic approach. My work is called Whole Child Equity. So I work in a more holistic work, and I work for an organization that was founded by the main commissioner for the National Academy of Sciences on the equity report in 2019. So we have a set of indicators that we've been, it's all laid out, but it really still is not fully a breadth of skills, we don't think. And so we're trying to see where to go from there nationally with, across the states and clearly national organizations. How can we be informative and be part of the solution as we, again, look to the new iteration of the law? Because I think what we're concerned about is that without the new law really embracing the breadth of skills and having ways to operationalize the accountability system in the breadth of skills, we're going to continue to really focus on academic skills, even though we talk about whole child and social emotional learning, and there are wonderful things going on in the United States in the local context, a host of wonderful practices and curriculum and pedagogy. But I still think we're really wrestling to see how we elevate breadth of skills in policy in the more accountability system, because it seems to end up being the driver of all things no matter what. So I would say I also, as you can tell, work with the Global Science of Learning Education Network. I am one of the advisors and leaders there. And our work, Dr. Roberta Lent from the University of De Janeiro is one of our leading advisors here. And so we're also trying to connect to the rest of the world through this work to really influence within the US, to bring it in, but also clearly to share out. And we wrestle with this all the time. I think the pandemic has really clearly elevated the need for change. And it's worldwide, we know, but we definitely know within the US, we need change and we need breadth of skills. We've been very fortunate to work with a great initiative in India with Mekshala Trust and the Common Ground Collaborative. And they've been able to use technology to really bring curriculum that is much more holistic into rural India using smartphones. And it's been a great experience. We've learned a lot in the US from them. So I think we have great opportunities really across the world to learn and share. But I really am interested in how we move this conversation into the policy level, because at least for us, we tend to lean more to what does the assessment at the end says, not so much, breadth of skills assessments that we need every day in our classrooms every week. We have that, but we don't have a good system around it. So I'm saying all of that to say, would love to hear more so that I can interject those findings in my own conversation here. Thank you.
That's incredible. Thank you so much, Vincent. And I have also lived in DC. I went to college in Boston, right? And then just thinking here, one key aspect, how is the core curriculum now being affected by this? Do you think is that a big change happening right now in the US with the core curriculum?
Yeah, meaning the state standards, right? Because we know the Common Core curriculum, at the end of the day, all 50 states have their own set of standards that drive. So for us, you know, curriculum is extremely important, but it's much more so about the state standards, which then drive the curriculum. So we still have the Common Core curriculum in most states, and that's broadly stated, of course, because we know this is the US and we do have the push and pull in what do we mean. So we won't go into that piece, but broadly speaking, we do have the Common Core curriculum in our states and in our territories. And that still drives the accountability system, the end of year assessments that are used for evaluation of the schools. And those are still academic. Now we do know, so that's still there, but we know there's a push and pull within each state, each region, that is really emphasizing curriculum and pedagogies that go way beyond the Common Core. So most states right now have the social emotional learning standards. And so those are actually driving, we think, a lot more of the curriculum and the curriculum delivery and the local assessments, but we still are not seeing them at all in assessments that drive the accountability system. So when things when they're not embedded in the accountability system, what we're finding is, yes, we get to them or we get to them somehow, but they still don't become the priority. It still is the math and reading. So we are trying to see how we can push harder to get more of these breadth of skills in the accountability system. It's hard. I am Jamaican, so there's a phrase we use, work on by the morning, can't come go to evening. We've just gone down such a bad path that it's hard to fix, and we rely on accountability system. And so I am at the policy level, looking to influence the next iteration of our federal policy in education to have this breadth of skills really centered there. So anything we can do to figure a way to learn together and we can influence into that system, that's where I am.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Everyone, I just put it here, the questions like in our chat. So if anyone just like want to look that over as well. And just a final thought on what Winsome said. What we tried to, we also had something similar to a core curriculum, common core curriculum in Brazil. In Brazil, we have more, it's more federation than like United States, right? In terms of like
correct
state. But the federal government is so bad in education in the past years, so that like the state and municipal levels had to be more protagonists on this. So what we did here in Rio, which is the largest municipal public education system in Latin America, we have 1,500 schools just in the city of Rio. And we rearranged the curriculum in a way that first we had, the idea was to have 2 years in one, right? 2020 and 2021. Right, and then now we are doing 3 years in 2. So we also adding 2022 to this group, right? So we are reprioritizing the curriculum in a way that we keep having like this continuous, it's a continuous process, right? But Catherine, Rebekah, Alison, any thoughts? It would be awesome to hear you all.
I was just having a few thoughts while Winsome was talking. As well as our work with Salzburg, we're also doing some work with like an advocacy group in the States called America Forward. I don't know if you're aware of them, but they're doing quite a lot of work around like breadth of skills. It's not specifically on assessment, but they're kind of doing quite a lot of work around trying to influence and the kind of a few sort of specific like policy ideas around breadth of skills. And I've also just posted a report that we did a year or two ago about kind of a palette of possibilities for creativity. And one of the things we've sort of had success with at the Lego Foundation has been because I think, and I don't know if you've experienced this, Renan, but like people don't really understand what you mean when you say breadth of skills, or like where you're starting from. And so we sort of landed on creativity as being a sort of wedge skill to go into the bigger conversations about, you know, assessment and pedagogy and curriculum. And now we're sort of, you know, moving more into that like social emotional learning as being another area. But like 2 years ago, before the pandemic, we would never have said like, what's the next skill you're going to talk about after creativity? We would have said critical thinking, or, you know, problem solving, or digital skills. But because of what's happened with the pandemic, just the conversation around social emotional learning has really kind of foregrounded in policy circles, like globally. And so now we're sort of starting to think about that as well as being sort of the next area where we're going to focus on. But I think that for us has been a useful tactic, a kind of convening point around one skill has been quite useful. But yeah, that's less on the kind of assessment point and more on the just generally. And then I think on assessment, the questions that I'm from the UK, but I live in Denmark. And in the UK, there is a really interesting kind of movement around assessment called Rethinking Assessment. And it's led by kind of, you know, in the UK, there's a good tradition of like, you know, super head teachers who start kind of academies, and they might have 20 or 30 schools in their jurisdiction. And in that sort of, there's also like education professors, and there's psychologists and educational psychologists, and they've kind of been putting together this movement about like, what might that look like to rethink assessment. And so for me, part of the conversation is about, like, is it evolution or revolution? Like, what are you trying to, you know, are you throwing everything out of the window? Like, one of the guys from Rethinking Assessment had this brilliant phrase, which was like, he thinks like in 30 years time, you won't leave school with a piece of paper, like you'll leave school with a URL, you know, which will be like a link to your home on the blockchain. I have no idea what that means, but, you know, in the metaverse, or all of these kind of really futuristic things. And, you know, when you ask Renan about whether like technology is like, you know, ally or not, probably both. You know, I think it probably will enable a lot of things that we don't think is possible, but in terms of like policymakers thinking this is something I understand and I can do something about, the more like technology, you know, the people who understand technology are like 20, the people who who make policy are like 50, like just massively stereotyped.
Exactly.
But, you know, and that's you know, and so that, you know, it's something that will enable the actual practical way that we will do assessment. But in terms of like, will it help us convince the policymakers who need to be convinced? Probably will do more to scare them off than to bring it in.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. Just to share like something that we faced recently. So we are in summer vacation right now, right, in the South Hemisphere. So school starts in February 7th, and we started for the first time a summer school program, right, in our municipal schools, because the idea of vacation is very unequal, right? Oh, I'm going for vacation, right? And if you are middle class or above, you travel, you go to the beach house, you go to like another state, whatever. I mean, 99% of my students, they stay in their territory, or they go to work with their parents selling drinks in the beach or whatever, things that they, and the school, which is the place that it's for them, you know, like the place that can bring something genuine, stays closed for 2 months, right? And of course, there are HR issues that we need to solve with that, but whatever. So we try to start this pilot program of summer schooling here. And the idea is to offer different, not normal classes, right? So we are teaching digital marketing, dance, whatever. And then we try to put like this summer school curriculum. And the first ideas were a little bit more technical. And then the students came to us and said, we want to learn about TikTok. And I was like, yeah, you know, this is what they're living right now. And then we had to the whole idea of the program, right? Because if you're not on TikTok right now, if you're not on their word, that's what these guys are using. And then the dance style, the music, the whatever is different. You know, the idea of 15 seconds and what they see and zooming an image, right? I was going to schools and 4 years old, they get magazines and they try to zoom with their fingers. So imagine how the mind of this kid works, right? And then you have such a mentality gap. And there is a correlation of age, of course. No matter what's your age, you can update yourself and become more digital, right? But there is a big gap. And this gap, a 2-year gap is already, it's something, right? So just sharing this because I thought it was super interesting.
Yeah, so I think in the States for us, we're getting away from this word reform. Now we're in the word transform. So that's our way of saying we're not edging anymore on what we've had, but we're going to make the flip and do big changes. But that's easier said than done when the system is so archaic, you know. So I think there's a tug of war between reform and transformation really going on. But
so Ren, if I may chip in here, what what you were saying is really fascinating. This story that you were telling just now, and this reminded me of one of the key findings of this OECD study on beyond academic learning. What they found was that in terms of social emotional skills, the 10-year-old children do much better than the 15-year-olds. Now, one of the things that strikes, and this is what we were talking to the colleagues here, is perhaps the way our school system is designed, it takes away the element of creativity, tries to mold the learner in a particular manner as they proceed. I think that is how we see probably the success of the school education system. Whereas the need of the hour is more in terms of expanding the capacity of the learner to learn. And that is possible only if we create those opportunities and not confine everything into 5 or 6 academic subjects that the learner is expected to mug and score good in that. And I think, therefore, one of the key policy reforms and embedded in those policy reforms should be a clear focus on building the capacity of the system itself, orienting them about the new ways of, say, learning and new ways of assessment. Because perhaps the way we have been doing it over the last so many years, that may not be relevant or useful going forward. But what that process could be is something that the system also needs to learn. And that takes me to the next question that you have put in this on the slide for discussion, that there are certain key stakeholders in the system, and the system will move only, would be contingent upon the capacity of those people to move. So how do we build the capacity, reorient them, get them new tools, get them to see how things can be done differently? That is going to probably show us the way. And I'll love to hear other panelists on this subject.
Yeah, that's great, Shalendra. Totally with you. Rebekah, do you want to share your thoughts?
So yeah, I'm Rebekah. I'm from the UK. I work for a children's charity. So I don't typically work in schools, but my point of view of skills and that type of development comes from I guess, a youth social action point of view. So it's quite difficult. So when you spoke about key stakeholders, I was thinking about the community and how you then link schools to that community, because if you're wanting to develop that metacognition skills, the understanding how young people think and learn, it's also important for them to understand how they interact with their communities, not just them learning maths, English, sciences, but what we try to do where I work is bringing those like social action elements into, let's say, a maths class or English class or science class. But I do recognize that comes from a point of view where it's like a charity giving money directly to school to implement these programs, which in many countries would not be possible or is not even feasible. And then we come into the technological element when right now we're living with COVID-19, to then have these type of programs in schools, you need the internet, you need those facilities, the funding, and you then come to that funding element. And how do you then bring that for technological advancements for schools to provide good learnings, substantial learnings and sustainable learnings that somewhat connects them to the wider world and not just within a small space. But for me, it's quite difficult because I don't come from a background where I work with kids in that sense, where it's like teaching them maths and English. It's given them that more creative skills where they have that fun, but they're also developing their I guess metacognition or agency or personal development. Those really the soft skills for employment, which we don't value as much, but they actually go quite a long way. So long way going around. I think for me, I think that there needs to be that element of flexibility in curriculum. But I come from a viewpoint where I live and work in the UK, and I understand that for many other countries, which are significantly bigger, that's just not possible to have that flexibility and to have that external involvement of large organisations to provide those funds and supports and extra learning opportunities. But those are my thoughts that are running in terms of that. Yeah.
Right. That's great.
I think let's pick up on something that you mentioned about like the kind of value of those employability skills. Like, you know, I call them soft skills. I try not to, because they're not, you know, they're not easy. They're not, you know, it's for a lot of kids, they're some of the most difficult skills to learn. But what we've been looking at, and I think it's really interesting to sort of, if you're trying to, you know, bring in stakeholders like private sector involvement. And, you know, as the LAGO Foundation, obviously we've got one foot in the private sector. And what we're seeing is like the change being led by big employers, you know, and both from the respect of like people like Google saying, well, you know, we don't really trust, we're not really that into universities, and we're not really into, you know, we don't need A-level like exam results. We're going to do our own system because we're not getting the people that we need. So that is a big like warning sign that like assessment systems are not fit for purpose for big employers, right? Then at the same time, you've got people like LinkedIn doing this kind of like you when you were talking, Renan, about like summer schools and, you know, like this kind of like micro credentialing and like short courses. And I was on this really weirdly helpful webinar the other day run by a like consulting firm who were like advising hedge funds who invest in education where to put their money. And they were saying this like lifelong learning, like you know, back like ed tech providers that are doing like reskilling for adults, but like these micro credentials, like these, you know. And I was just like, well, you know, I would never have thought, but that's the kind of, you know, if you're trying to open a wedge issue, like going in with like jobs, economy, finance, something that'll, you know, interest the finance minister as well as the education minister is always quite a good place to start. And, you know, I think our role at the foundation is often about trying to make that argument that like these, you know, social emotional learning is not this like soft skill, but, you know, is, and that argument is getting easier to win, you know. And I think the other kind of, you know, what you were saying, Rebekah, about like metacognition and resilience and, you know, all of these things, like they're completely what, you know, what employers are asking for. And like WEF, the World Economic Forum, in their Future of Work report, they're saying, you know, creativity, problem solving is what's needed. So it's almost like that's, you know, as much as you want to be able to win the argument by saying it's like holistically a good thing for a child to have a breadth of skills, like you also can make that argument of like, and also the earlier you invest in skills, the more money you're going to save yourself at the end of the, you know, at the end of it. But that's a difficult argument to win.
That's great, Catherine. And I think like it's super connected, right? How we go from like the one of these topics and what like Rebekah brings us with the third sector and role as well, right? With this, and I think like that from a government perspective, and coming from the third sector and working with advocacy and some, there is such an important role. First of all, to put light on foreign topics, right? And advocacy is a great way to do that. For innovation, right? And for innovation, there's so much things that we can do with pilots and investments directly for that. And there's one thing that I think it's really important, because we know that the transatlantic, like the big ship is the government, right? When the government decides, at least for us here in Brazil and in many countries that I know, that's when they have like big scale and so on. But that needs to be pushed, right? And you also need to like have evidence that proves that the public policies, because sometimes we see that people gamble really with public policy decisions, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to do this because I think it's cool, right? Like, okay, there's not so much room for, you know, that opinion, right? Of course, I want you, if you feel something because it's based on experience that you see that work, if you want to innovate, but there's so much that we already know that works, right? And sometimes it lacks political capital, sometimes it lacks, like, you know, a decision to move forward of that. But I also think there is some things very interesting on what Rebekah brought and Catherine adds to this, that I think like the foundations and the third sector in general, there is this idea of bring the different socioeconomic groups involved with the education, right? Like, and even the elites, no matter what we call the elites of the society, they get involved in interesting in a service that sometimes that they don't use directly, right? So for example, here, there are some parts of the city that people have no idea what is the public education, what we are doing, right? Because their kids don't go to our schools, because they don't see, and then the consequence of that's what? They don't demand better service for this, right? So if they start to share these spaces, right? If they start to share, I think that the pandemic was something that, for example, going to a place in which you have to get the vaccine and everyone has to go to that, you know, you're using that service, it shows you that that is important, right? And I think that's the thing that we need to do more in education. We need to show, you know, the different groups, that's what we're facing, right? And yeah, the Catherine saying, right, the America Forward, Teach for America does that as well, right? You get like teachers from like schools. I'm not saying that like that's the best thing for education, but I'm saying that you present to a group of people that will never see that environment, you know, something that is important for you to care. And if you care, you do something for that problem, right? And sometimes people don't care because they don't know that exists, right? Which is the central problem for inequality, like vast inequality, right?
And I think there's also like, to bring it back to assessment, like there's that point of like, there's almost this inertia where it's, well, I'm in the system and I'm doing all right, like as a policymaker, and I got here through that route. So what's wrong with that route? And I think that's something that's not just about assessment. There's quite a lot of different policy areas where that applies. But I think here, that the qualifications can be so concrete, whereas a lot of this other stuff is so like abstract that it's, it's quite difficult to put those things against each other, like until you've got, this like evidence-based, piloted, successful alternative that's like ready to go. It's really difficult to kind of have that argument. I think some of the effort that Brookings have done and a bit of what this America Forward stuff is about, like trying to imagine, like help people imagine it. And as you're saying, Renan, it's really hard for people to imagine what that, what the reality is for children in schools and families. It's also really hard for them to imagine what assessment looks like if it doesn't look like exactly what it looks like now.
But it is true, though, that we have many examples of those in states and districts and jurisdictions. We have network schools in the US who've been doing those. So we have many, many examples. It's hard to get it more in the mainstream.
Yeah.
Without that federal policy. I think one of the things we're going to have to do to influence whole child assessments, breadth of skills is what you call them, is really redefine learning. I think we have a very overly defined way of actualizing what we mean by learning. Like learning is about what you educate students in a school, but the brain learns all the time. And actually, as Rebekah says, what we need to do is to begin to look at the entire ecosystem and where students are learning within the entire ecosystem, and bring that into our education programs so that schools, community, I use what I call an inside-outside strategy. I work with school districts, but I work from the outside. I work with communities and move them into schools. And that tends to really influence a lot what leaders in the system, they see. Not only are they sharing information, but they see better roles for the families and community in supporting learning beyond just academic skills. So a more holistic approach. So I think we have to redefine learning to be able to redefine the assessments to go with it.
Yeah, true. I think you have just hit the nail. Truly, we have to redefine learning itself. It is so narrowly defined at the moment. It has to be broadened.
Your foundation is with you on that one.
I think we're
so it looks like
here.
Yeah, it looks like our breakout rooms are going to close. So I just wanted to thank everyone for such a great discussion, and thanks Renan for presenting. It was great.
That was awesome.
It's really good. Nice to meet you.
Everyone. Very nice to meet you all.
Thank you. Nice to meet all of you.
Thank you so much.